We don't want that flag. We don't want the anthem. We don't want this political class. We want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history.
Farage. Joining us now is Nigel Farage, co-president of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy Group and national leader for the United Kingdom's Independence Party. Nigel, can you update the listeners globally on what is happening in Europe? How bad is it over there?
It's just a real mess. I mean, there is total confusion, fear, a total paralysis, actually, and no one knows what's really going on. 6 weeks ago, the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, said that we had 6 weeks to save the European economy and possibly the global economy too. And the deadline was the Cannes summit, which has been and gone last weekend. And you could tell from the European leaders leaving that summit, their faces like thunder, that nothing had been agreed. And Obama's face was an absolute picture at the press conference when he described his own incomprehension at actually who was in charge in Europe. And of course he's absolutely right, because we have a European Commission headed up by Mr. Barroso. We have a European Council headed up by Herman Van Rompuy. We have a Eurozone group headed up by a Luxembourger called Mr. Juncker. I mean, who actually is in charge of this incredible bureaucratic structure of unelected people? The buck doesn't stop with anybody. And you see, we're used to democracies. I mean, if something chaotic and disastrous happens in the American economy, the buck stops with Obama because he's the guy that's been elected to be the president. We haven't got anything like a democratic structure within the Euro countries. And frankly, my feeling now is that all the while the problem was with Greece and Portugal and Ireland, serious though the problem was, they were relatively small economies compared with the overall size of the Eurozone. But now we have Italy, which is the third biggest member of the Eurozone, and interest rates, their rates they have to pay as a government to borrow money in the free market, have shot up this week. And so we now face the real doom scenario for the euro, that if the Italian government can't finance its debts, where on earth are 2 or 3 trillion euros going to come from to bail out Italy? So it looks to me, and I've been saying this for some time on your program, that I always felt this thing would fail, but I think we're very much nearer to the failure being really huge and possibly very dramatic indeed.
Nigel, can you give listeners globally an idea of where the Germans, the British, the French are with this? Are they getting pretty fed up with all of this?
Well, the British are in an odd position. We, of course, are an island off continental Europe, geographically and politically, as far as the euro itself is concerned. Don't forget that we still have the British pound. So we're not as directly involved in this crisis as the other continental countries are. But I think that where the real anger is beginning to well up is inside Germany. You see, Germany had its disasters. Well, it had its political disasters, but it also had an economic disaster. And back in 1923, the German currency, because of hyperinflation, became literally valueless. So the Germans, and especially since 1945, have always been a very fiscally prudent nation. Now, they've just been through 20 years, of course, of paying for Eastern Germany to reintegrate with Western Germany after the wall came down. So if you're a West German taxpayer, you've picked up a really heavy bill over the last 20 years. Now, you're being told you've got to bail out Greece, you've got to bail out Ireland, Portugal, and possibly even Italy. And for hard-working German people to be told that they've got to sign a blank check in perpetuity to southern European nations who have a completely different work ethic and culture is something that increasingly is becoming unacceptable. And that is why Mrs. Merkel, doesn't just commit yet more vast sums of German money to bailing out other countries, because she knows that at home it's just become unacceptable.
What about the French, Nigel? Do you have word from your friends over in France about what their take is on the situation?
The French seem to be in a slightly more neutral position, not really sure what to make of it all. There are French presidential elections coming up in May of next year, and their parliamentary elections in June of next year. There are increasingly in France voices being raised saying, look, this whole thing's been a terrible mistake. We should never have joined the Eurozone in the first place. But I would say that that is still, in France, just about a minority view. And the French are kind of hoping and praying that it's all going to be okay. But they haven't really, as a nation, had a proper full debate on this, not in the way the Germans have done. And right across Northern Europe, I mean, in countries like Finland, in countries like the Netherlands, I mean, there is a growing public anger saying, why on earth should we, at a time when our economies are weak, at a time when we ourselves have problems with big government borrowing figures, why on earth are we committing to this project that seems to be so misconstructed that it kind of doesn't matter how much money you throw at the problem, it always comes back and asks for more.
Nigel, when you look at the Italian situation that's now at the forefront in Italy, how do you solve these problems?
Well, the way we're currently trying to solve the problem is by saying the euro is fine as an idea, and all we need to do is move towards a deeper fiscal and political union, and all will be fine. But I don't think that's going to work. And I actually think we'd be far better off accepting that many of these countries should never have joined the Eurozone in the first place. They need to get out. There are going to be some significant defaults, and banks are going to take, and governments too, are going to take some fairly big hits. But actually sometimes in life, if you're trapped in something that is just wrong and doomed to failure, it's better to recognize that, take the short-term pain, and then actually allow yourself to get back on your feet. And one can think of a little island in between you guys and us called Iceland, who, of course, in 2008 were overwhelmed, if you remember, by the banking crisis. The country basically went bankrupt, and not only did they have a big volcanic explosion that year, but it seemed that a sort of economic winter had descended upon Iceland. And yet, do you know the funny thing? As we come out of the end of 2011, Iceland has now got itself re-established, and she's got an economy that is back growing again. I think we've got to recognize this whole thing has been a failure, cut and run, start again with a blank sheet of paper.
When you say start again with a blank sheet of paper, is that nations having their own currencies again, or is that going a bit too far with it?
Well, I don't think it'll work that way, because I think that for now, the northern European nations would stick together in what would effectively become a greater Deutschmark zone, because you can argue that economically the differences between, let's say, Germany and the Netherlands and Finland are not that great. They have similar work ethics, they have similar practices. But I think that for the Mediterranean countries, there's no way longer term they're going to stay in the euro, and they've now got the opposite problem to the north. They are now trapped inside a regime which is demanding huge public spending cuts without the compensation of a currency devaluing. And I listened to a German economist the other week, a man in his 80s, a man who'd seen it all in his lifetime, including the rise of Hitler and the destruction of Germany in 1945, and he made the point that actually what the EU is now imposing upon Greece reminds him of the von Breuning budgets in Germany in the early 1930s, which led to 6 million unemployed, and which directly, of course, led to Hitler. The Greeks will not put up with their democracy being stripped from them, with austerity packages being put upon them at a time of huge unemployment and increasing poverty. I mean, frankly, if we go on pushing nations like Greece in this direction, my fear is that the problem in the end will not just be economic, it'll be social. Do not discount the fact that there could be nothing short of a revolution in Greece if we carry on down this course. That is just how dangerous this whole thing is.
Nigel, with Europe going into disarray as badly as it has, recently many of the countries inside of the Eurozone are starting to ask their central banks, or at least some of the politicians, what is the status of our gold? And the central banks in some cases have been less than forthcoming. Now we're hearing the Germans want to get hold of their physical gold, get it back to Germany. The Germans don't know if they have it or if it's been leased out and it's gone into the marketplace. What about the situation with the gold and the European central banks? What's happening there?
Huge rows, as you say, big suspicion in Germany as to where the gold is. The Greeks, of course, demanding that the Germans give back the gold that they believe was taken from them in World War II. So this is uncovering some pretty ancient and bitter rivalries. And of course, the British government, where Gordon Brown famously sold most of our gold reserves at $284 an ounce. So, gold is not just a big play in the financial market, it's a big play in the whole debate and architecture of the current Eurozone woes.
Do you suspect then, Nigel, that many of the central banks in Europe have leased out their gold? It's out of those vaults and it's gone, and there's paper promises to return it that probably won't ever be able to be redeemed?
I just do not know the answer to that question. But if I look at just how poorly the central banks have performed over the last decade or so, frankly, nothing would surprise me. There seems to be almost no limit to the stupidity of these people.
Nigel, I generally ask you about gold. Last time you were on, you were bullish. Gold's gone a lot higher since that time period. But what about gold from a bigger picture perspective? Because the audience should know by now, but you traded gold for over 2 decades.
I did, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, gold has gone up a huge, huge amount already. But I'm just looking at this prospect of Italy possibly going into default. If that happens, an awful lot more banks are going to go down. And governments may face the position where they just simply cannot go on using taxpayers' money to bail out banks. So I think there is a real possibility of very unpleasant banking collapses. And I think in the face of that, if you've got gold in your portfolio, I think you've got to keep it.
Coming back around to Europe then, Nigel, you brought up the banks failing there. I'm just wondering in your mind how that all shakes out, because when you talk about banks failing, taxpayers not being able to backstop them, that really is chaos.
It's a very dangerous thing. There is no escaping the fact that we've not been in as much potential trouble as this since perhaps 1931. That's where we are. That's where we are. This looks like it could be as bad as the Great Depression of the early 1930s. Things are moving beyond the control of governments. Governments have made huge, catastrophic, historic errors. They've overspent. They've failed to recognize that problem early enough. Here in Europe, they've constructed a currency that should never, ever have allowed the Mediterranean fringe into it. And we are facing this huge, huge indebtedness problem. Yep, we're headed into very, very troubled times.
Is there a chance here, Nigel, for a return to the gold standard?
I don't think that at the moment a return to the gold standard or anything like that, frankly, is possible. I think that course of action, whether it's the right one or not is another question, but that course of action would only happen after there'd been a bust. It certainly won't happen yet.
Nigel, the situation in Europe is clearly turning into a bigger nightmare. You warned about this a long time ago. What should we expect in the coming weeks and months ahead for Europe?
Well, Berlusconi today has just about survived a vote in the Parliament in Rome, but his coalition partners are now calling on him to resign, so we're going to see chaos there. And what we're going to see from the European bosses is we're going to see more bullying and more nastiness. And just last week, Papandreou, who was then the Greek Prime Minister, suggested that maybe the Greek people should have a referendum to decide whether they will accept these bailout packages and the terms. And for uttering the R word, he had everybody in Europe absolutely doing their best to destroy him. They have destroyed him. Greece has lost its democracy. The bully boys of Brussels are using this financial chaos to set up something that is akin to a dictatorship. These are horrible, horrible times.
Nigel, when you mentioned before that it's like 1931, is there a possibility that you're looking at that all over again in Europe?
Well, I think there is, and of course it was banking collapses in 31 that really led to things being bad. And of course now what we've done is we've lumbered ourselves with a European social market model for our labour forces, which leaves us hopelessly uncompetitive in the face of the Far East. And I mean, countries like Italy, I mean, their industrial production, their foreign and direct investment has collapsed in the last 5 years. You ask yourself, if the banks go bust, what on earth is going to be left in some of these countries?
So Europe faces the very real possibility of another depression.
Well, they may be lucky and it may be staved off, but I'm beginning to feel there is a certain inevitability now that the crisis that has been created by all of these mistakes is now bigger than governments themselves. And if we get the kind of banking collapses that I now believe are possible, we could be headed into something that we haven't seen for over 70 years. A Great Depression is not impossible.
Nigel Farage, co-president of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy.
We don't want that flag. We don't want the anthem. We don't want this political class. We want the whole thing consigned to the dustbin of history.